An Odd Boy, Volume 1 by Ngak'chang Rinpoche, Chapter 4, Part 2. The Dave Clark Five had a few other hits before disbanding in 1969, but I can only remember bits and pieces. Dave Clark Five's Glad All Over ousted the Beatles from the number 1 position in the charts in 1964. The newspapers were full of typical semi-literate banality about it. The Beatles were a thing of the past. My classmates, already irritated by my poetry, classical music and loathing of sport, took to baiting me about my favourite band being dethroned. It irritated them even more that I remained unaffected by their taunts. I considered them vapid, as I had no sense of having to support the Beatles as if they were a football team. Steve said, "The newspapers think it's really exciting that the drummer sings and has his drums out in front of the guitars, saxophone and keyboards. My dad says it's just a gimmick." I'd heard the word gimmick back in junior school, and that's what it was. The Beatles released the film Hard Day's Night later that year, and the Dave Clark Five responded with Catch As If You Can. I was in no hurry. I'd rather catch a cold. The other lads were all turning their shirts back to front on the way to school to look like Dave Clark, and it amused me to observe them partially strangulate themselves in order to achieve this end. Eventually they came round to my way of thinking. I decided not to mention it, and they said nothing to the effect that I'd been ahead of them in my view of the situation. The English football club Crystal Palace adopted Glad All Over as their song. I made no comment, but was amused by the poetic justice of Glad All Over being taken to the hearts of football fans. That was where it belonged. Jealousy had arisen the year before concerning my Beatle jacket, and the boys finally asked me where I purchased it. I had to admit that it came from Germany. "So it's not a real Beatle jacket," Maurice Malcolm sneered. Maurice looked like such a caricature of a sneerer that I almost laughed. "Never said it was a real Beatle jacket. I didn't call it anything." Maurice thought about that for a moment and barked, "Yeah, but you let us think it was a real Beatle jacket." There was no winning in an argument like that. You fellows called it a Beatle jacket. I just didn't disagree with you. What would have been the point of saying it wasn't? It's no different from the jackets the Beatles wear, which is why you called it a Beatle jacket in the first place. That these jackets were just traditional German casual wear the Beatles had picked up in Hamburg was a lame argument as far as they were concerned. The discussion became decidedly asinine as others joined in, all feeling they'd been duped. I told them that their problems with my jacket had nothing to do with me. "If you want jackets like the Beatles wear, you'll just have to go to Germany and buy them yourselves." This just infuriated them, and they convinced themselves that my jacket only looked something like a Beatle jacket and that I was a fraud. Patricia Jenkinson's mother had been in Germany with her husband when he was posted there at the conclusion of World War II and knew all about the Beatles buying them in Hamburg. She'd seen such jackets back then and vouched for my story with Patricia. Patricia told the girls in the class that the boys were all idiots. Things settled down after that, but there was still some lingering resentment amongst the boys about the fact that they'd lost face. Maurice Malcolm, confronted by the facts, sneered, "No one wants a stupid beetle jacket anymore anyway. They're old hat now, and they've been beaten by the Dave Clark Five." The Beatles were démodé. No, I didn't think so. I had other opinions. Having put the evidence of my crimes of temperament and taste together, my male classmates united in favour of ostracism. I became a conversational outcast. I cannot remember how long it was that they refused to speak to me or acknowledge my existence. It could have been a term. It may have been a few weeks, but it was not uncomfortable. The girls were happy to take me in, and so I had the company I preferred. Apart from Steve, boys were surplus to requirement. My friendship with Alice still lingered in my mind as an ideal, and I continually tried to replicate what I could of that previous ease of communication. I think I must have been looking for Alice symbolically and failing to find her. It seemed as if life had changed in some mysterious way, and that situations were far more complex than they'd previously been. But still, as with Alice, getting to know the girls encouraged an adventure into intriguing influences. I read them my poetry. They listened with interest. Those who wrote poetry began reading me theirs. Lindsay Goulding enjoyed poetry, and we often read each other's poems. She liked what I wrote. She thought it was highly eccentric, but said that she admired how I used language in such unusual ways. Trees are very secretive. They whisper to the wind, secrets that are never known to human ear or mind. Everybody has someone to think of now and then, but trees really have no one, so I think I'll be their friend. Those secrets they tell no one, for no one can they see, can really understand them. No one, that is, except me. Lindsay Goulding, My Secret Friends, 1963. Some of them who'd not previously written poetry decided they'd explore it. They seemed intrigued that you could write poetry about anything at all. The sound of the wind, the colour of stones, the way moss feels, and anything that makes contact with the senses. I wrote poetry about the woods, about trees and streams. The sun filtered down through the branches like lace. The moss beneath my feet was softly damp, and I skimmed through the woodlands, the wind against my face, and I lived for each moment, each hour of grace. As I speed through the trees barefooted and free, I could fly on forever like a wave on the sea, and free for always I just have to be, as the need for my freedom was born inside me. Lindsay Goulding, Freedom, 1964. I'd tell them about what I had been reading. Their interest in my explorations enabled me to see a world ripe for discovery and projected me further into the cultural shift that became the lost time. Looking back, I can follow the life threads of art, music, poetry, literature, lexicology, and history to the time I spent in the company of those girls. These threads are the woven fabric of weirdness that comprises the eccentric life and art of the odd boy I continued to be. My best friends amongst the girls were Lindsay Goulding and Carol Williams. I know Lindsay still today. She has been able to fill in various empty spaces for me with regard to what happened. She remembers my unusual clothing. I was surprised to hear that she and Sandra Roberts discussed my situation at home, and that Lindsay was on the brink of coming round to give my father a piece of her mind. Sandra thought that it might make matters worse. I never spoke of my situation with the girls, and was surprised to hear this after 40 years. The boys' names have drifted somewhat. There was a George, a Paul, and a John, but no Ringo. There was an Eric, but no Jack or Ginger. Beyond that, I remember little. None wished to remain in contact with me. I cannot say I blame them. I was an odd boy, and they were what they were. They were probably all normal, healthy boys who simply found me too eccentric for human company. I talked with the girls about painting and music, but they didn't quite connect with my interest in blues until similar music started appearing in the charts. They then thought I was frightfully clever to have been interested way before blues was heard. I talked about wanting to play guitar and how I tried to learn when I was at Steve Bruce's home. Sometimes I got a little too technical about guitar names and songs they'd never heard, but in general they were patient with me. I remember singing to them once, and they found my singing accent quite funny. I had to explain to them that these were songs by Black Americans and that they pronounced words differently. They also constructed sentences differently. They wondered where I had learned these things, and I told them about Mr. Love. I talked with them about history and geography. There are thousands of lakes in Finland and thousands of islands off the Finnish coast. I told them that it reminded me of what happens when you throw a rock into the sea. Globules of water fly into the air, and air bubbles are plunged into the waves. The Finnish coast seemed like that to me. I was still enthralled with Vikings and Nordic history at age 13, and read whatever I could find. I'd learned that when the Norwegians and Swedes took to God, they lost their power. They lost Odin and Thor and were tyrannized by the Finns. That fascinated me. There was a whole Norse world, and I was keen to know more about it. Iceland once belonged to Denmark. Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, discovered America. If Harold of Wessex had been beaten at Stamford Bridge by Harald Hardrada of Norway, Britain would have been spared God for a few hundred years. This appealed to me. I had nothing against Jesus. I thought he was a truly great person because he talked about kindness and tolerance. It was God that vexed me. Jesus had long hair and had driven the Gabardine swine off the cliff. He was someone I could respect, even though I mistook Gadarene for Gabardine. I must have thought the Gabardine swine were business-suited representatives from the sartorial department of Moloch. I had mixed feelings about the religious education classes at Netherfield. I found the topic extremely interesting, but the teacher, Mrs. Pendrake, had probably been found in a cabinet in the British Museum. Lindsay described her as a reptile. She's a smug, self-satisfied prune. That was about the way of it. She's a useless teacher too. She just makes us copy down the stuff in those old notebooks of hers. I nodded. Yes, I'd rather have my head in a bucket of greasy earwigs than listen to her for more than 5 minutes. That made Lindsay laugh. I always wondered why the things I said made the girls laugh so much. Lindsay told me that it was the extra words I added. They aren't just earwigs. They had to be greasy earwigs.